Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to the sun-scorched Levant, where the front lines have carved themselves into ancient earth and the war shows no mercy to anyone, loyal or otherwise. Between the armies there are men who wear borrowed faces, and the border they must one day cross is not only made of wire and mud. This is one such crossing. My name is Luke Chabrol. I was born in the lower city of New Antioch in the year of our Lord 1887, the third son of a customs official and a woman who read fortunes for extra coin on market days, which, as it turned out, was the more useful profession. I grew up watching people pretend to be something they weren't. My mother did it every time she turned a card over and saw something bad in it. A slight softening, a redirected emphasis, the specific kindness of a woman who knows the truth and chooses how much of it to deliver. My father did it every time he waved through a cargo he'd been paid not to inspect. A different skill, more mercenary in its application, but built on the same raw material. By the time I was 12, I could read a lie in a man's eyes the way other boys read weather. By the time I was 16, I had stopped bothering to be surprised by it. The assessors found me at 19. I say found, I mean recruited. There was an interview, conducted by a woman who introduced herself with a name I later confirmed was false, in a room above a chandler's shop in the harbor quarter. Then a test, which took 3 weeks and which I was told afterward I had passed by virtue of not having noticed I was being tested. Then 3 months in a building I was never given the address of, taught by men and women whose real names I never learned and whose faces I was discouraged from examining too carefully. The church does not advertise its intelligence arm. It does not need to. It recruits from the population of people who already understand that the visible surface of things and the operational reality beneath them are different instruments playing the same piece at different octaves, and then it teaches those people to be precise about the difference. I had been across the wire twice before the Levant posting, once in the Somme salient under a French alias that lasted 11 days. Returning with documentation of Heretic artillery range-finding methods that the church's gunners called invaluable, which was a word they used precisely. Once in Flanders under a Flemish identity that lasted 3 weeks and ended with me extracted through a drainage culvert at 2 in the morning while church engineers worked the pump station 30 meters away and tried not to look at what was coming out. Both times I came back with what I'd been sent for. Both times I came home. The Levant posting was meant to be the same. It was not the same. My cover identity for this assignment was Vasek Kren, branded conscript from the Rhine cantons, not church territory, not deep heretic heartland either, one of the gray border zones where men get swept up by whoever is recruiting that season, and the paperwork rarely gets checked with any seriousness. The branding had been done 4 months before insertion, to give the skin time to scar properly, to develop the slight ridge and discoloration that a fresh mark doesn't have. Not deep, not the real thing, not spiritually genuine, but enough to pass a physical inspection in adequate light. The assessors have surgeons who know how to make a false mark look old and earned. The surgeons are well paid and do not discuss the details of their work at dinner parties. Neither do I. I tell you about the false brand because it matters. In the Heretic legions, the brand is not decoration. It is not the way a soldier wears a regimental badge, a mark of belonging that can be granted or revoked by institutional process. It is covenant, a thing done in the blood and affirmed by powers older than the institution that now makes use of them. The old gods read it differently than a sergeant reads a pay ledger. That is a thing I understood in theory before the Levant. It became a thing I understood in my blood and marrow before the end, in the space of 40 seconds in the dark, with something walking above me that I still have no adequate name for. In the 44th Heretic Legion, 3rd Company, the day began at 4 in the morning, not with a bugle. The heretics had no bugles, or if they once had, they'd given them to some chaos musician who'd made them into something else. Repurposed them for whatever rituals those musicians served and didn't speak about outside their own company. The day began instead with the groaning shift change of the night watch coming off the fire step, boots on duckboards, whispered curses in 4 languages, The particular sound of men who have been cold and alert for 6 hours settling into the relative warmth of the bunkers. And then Sergeant Dakan moving through the main sleeping area with a boot heel and a flat command in his particular blend of low Gothic and something older that I was never able to place. It wasn't a language I'd been briefed on. I'd let the question go in the first month, which was the right decision. There are questions in the Heretic lines that you don't ask, not because asking them is dangerous, but because the answers may require you to know things that complicate your occupation of the identity you've been assigned. Vasek Kren slept in the lower bunk of the third-tier rack, nearest the drainage ditch. I had taken it deliberately on the first day. Nobody else wanted it. And having the worst bunk in the section meant nobody looked at me twice. A man who has claimed the worst bunk has made his social position clear without words, and his social position is beneath the notice of men with better bunks who have a natural interest in maintaining the hierarchy that benefits them. The smell from the ditch was considerable. You grew accustomed to it. I grew accustomed to most things in the 44th by the second month, which was either a professional achievement or a concerning adaptation, depending on how you framed it. I chose not to frame it either way and simply noted it and moved on, because framing things is a luxury of men who have time, and in the 44th you were rarely the proprietor of your own time. Morning stand-to was the same on both sides of any wire. You climbed to the fire step before first light, rifle across the parapet, and you watched the gray nothing of no man's land until the sky brightened enough to see the first 100 meters across it. In New Antioch's lines, it was a devotional act, a prayer made physical, the body oriented toward the enemy and toward God simultaneously, the dawn observed as both military necessity and liturgical discipline. In the 44th, it was more austere than that, a mutual agreement not to be surprised, the line expressing its vigilance without theological framework. We stood for 40 minutes in the chill of the Levant morning, watching the wire and the craters in the dark, and then stood down for breakfast. Breakfast was black bread, sometimes dried meat that I learned in the first week not to examine too closely, and in the second week to accept without examination as simply a component of the day's fuel, and a tin cup of something hot that tasted of chicory and old smoke, and occasionally something that had no business being in a breakfast beverage, but which I noted and filed and didn't comment on, because Vasek Kren did not comment on things. He ate what was put in front of him and moved on. He had been at the front long enough not to have opinions about food that required expressing. This made him easy to perform at mealtimes, which was fortunate, because mealtimes in the 44th were the most socially complex part of the day, the one time when the section assembled in one place and the micro-hierarchies played themselves out with the particular efficiency of men who have nothing to do with their social energy except spend it on each other. Dakan's eye was always moving at breakfast. He sat at the far end of the bench with his own tin and worked through it methodically, and while he ate, he watched his men with the specific quality of attention that certain sergeants develop over years of necessary consequence, not obvious, not direct, but comprehensive. In 3 months, I had never once caught him looking at me for longer than it took to issue an order, but I felt him the way you feel a change in air pressure before you understand where it's coming from. He was one of those men who know things before they can explain how they know them, and I had never been able to determine whether what he knew about Vasek Kren had crossed any of the thresholds that mattered. After breakfast came work. In the 44th, work meant maintaining what the trench required, not the fighting, not the dying, but the administrative infrastructure of a position that needed to be held through weather and shelling and the particular entropy of packed earth that wants to be left alone and will express this preference by collapsing inward if given the opportunity. Shoring up, revetting timbers, filling sandbags with the specific inefficiency of a man performing a task that will need to be performed again in a week regardless of how well he performs it now. Repairing wire gaps under cover of the morning mist, which provided concealment from snipers and also a particular quality of cold moisture that penetrated every layer of clothing and stayed there until evening, clearing drainage channels, servicing the machine gun positions, the work of Empire at the tactical level, which is mostly labor and boredom with violence interspersed at intervals chosen by someone else. I had been assigned to the maintenance section in my first week, which was unglamorous enough to make me functionally invisible. A man filling sandbags is furniture. The front is full of furniture. Furniture doesn't generate suspicion and doesn't invite conversation and doesn't get asked to account for itself. I preferred to be furniture. Maintenance work had a further professional advantage. It moved you through the trench system in ways that a fighting assignment didn't. In a morning's work party, I could cover 400 meters of line, noting positions, garrison strengths, equipment status, the patterns in supply runs, the emplacement angles of heavy weapons, all of it passing through Vasek Kren's unremarkable hands and eyes without anyone looking twice at the man carrying the sandbags. This was the information I'd been sent to gather. By month 3, I had filled it in thoroughly enough that even if I had been extracted on the first day of that month, the posting would have been considered successful by any reasonable assessment standard. The intelligence I'd compiled was clean, current, and operationally significant. Extraction takes time to arrange regardless of whether the intelligence is complete. And so Vasek Kren continued. At noon there was a short ration break. I used it on most days to find a private enough corner of the communication trench to sit with my bread and spend 15 minutes being nothing and no one, neither Luke, who was watching, nor Vasek, who was eating. The performance requires suspension to survive long deployment. This is the part the assessor's trainers describe as the necessary void, and the part that sounds clinical in a classroom and becomes something else entirely when you're sitting in the mud 6,000 miles from anything you recognize as yours, holding a borrowed identity around yourself like a coat that doesn't quite fit. You find the corners that are quiet enough. You eat your bread. You let the noise of the front, the guns, the mortars, the sniper cracks, the routine mechanical violence of a Tuesday afternoon wash over you without requiring a response from either persona. And then you put the coat back on and go back to work. Once a week, on the day I marked as Thursday in my internal calendar, I signaled. The system was a standard assessor's field protocol, a shielded lantern at the base of a specific gap in the parapet, positioned so the signal transmitted on a narrow eastward angle, a 2-minute window that opened 40 minutes after the official last light of the day. The code was simple, not encrypted in any complex sense, but specific enough that a Heretic signals intelligence unit would need to have been briefed on the particular protocol to interpret it. What it carried was narrow, a status indicator, a week's summary of unit composition, and a count of observable operational changes since the last signal. The lamplighter received it from a church observation position approximately 300 meters east. I never met the lamplighter. I don't know who they were, whether they were an embedded intelligence asset, a forward observer with a secondary assignment, or a local civilian who had been recruited and compensated and was managing their own fear with whatever methods worked for them. The apparatus is built on compartmentalization. You know your own piece. You trust the rest is handled, because if you don't trust the rest is handled, you stop being able to do your own piece, and then nothing gets handled and people die. In 4 postings, I have found this trust to be, on balance, warranted. The Thursday signals were the moments I was most afraid, not because the act itself was high risk. I had done it 15 times without incident, and the procedure was practiced to the point where the mechanical execution required no conscious effort. The fear was in the transition. 2 minutes before the window, I had to be enough of myself to execute the protocol correctly. 2 minutes after the window closed, I had to be enough of Vasek Kren to survive the rest of the evening. The crossing between those 2 states is not seamless. It never is, after enough repetitions. The identity you're performing begins to feel more natural than the one underneath it, and the one underneath begins to feel like the performance. And in the space between them, there is a moment of vertigo that you have to navigate carefully and alone and without giving any outward sign of it. The thing about living undercover for months is that drift is inevitable. The assessor's trainers say this in the first week of identity training and repeat it at intervals throughout, and you nod at it in the way you nod at warnings about things you haven't yet experienced and therefore don't yet know how to fully hear. And then you experience it. You become the cover so thoroughly that the original architecture underneath begins to feel like the thing you're maintaining rather than the thing you are. Vasek Kren ate and worked and slept and complained about the rations in precisely calibrated measure and participated in the crude social rituals of the enlisted men with the appropriate degree of reluctance. All of that was Luke Chabrol making it happen, but after enough repetitions, the distinction between the maker and the made gets harder to hold in focus. I kept Luke Chabrol somewhere careful, in the Thursday signals, in the noon silences, in the specific quality of attention with which I noted things that Vasek Kren would never have noticed. The officer's habits, the section's unspoken social dynamics, the pattern variations in supply deliveries that might indicate operational changes. He lived in the watching. He waited and maintained himself as best he could, and trusted that the watching would eventually serve a purpose that would make the maintenance worth the cost of it. I was 3 days from extraction when the Void Prophet came to the 44th. 3 days. I had done 3 days before in positions considerably more exposed than this one, with less preparation and less time to develop the local knowledge that provides a degree of insulation. 3 days is a short distance when you can see the end of it, and the end is a known destination, and all you have to do is not change anything that hasn't already changed for 3 more days, and then the apparatus does the rest. But the end of a posting does something to a man. The closer the extraction gets, the more the original architecture asserts itself, pushing at the cover from inside in ways that are small and individually inconsequential, and collectively potentially fatal. You have been careful for so long that the careful starts to feel like the effort rather than the performance, and you want, in some wordless way that you don't give language to because giving it language is its own kind of risk. You want to put it down, even briefly, even in some tiny, invisible way, and that wanting makes you slightly less careful than you have been, and slightly less careful is all it takes. I had made one small mistake. I did not know this yet. The Void Prophet arrived at the 44th on a Wednesday afternoon when the sun had moved behind the ridge to the west and the temperature in the trenches dropped from merely unpleasant to actively cold. He was not attached to 3rd Company permanently. He belonged to the regimental staff, drifting between units at a schedule that answered to no one's calendar but his own. I had seen him at a distance twice before. A tall figure in vestments the color of old wax, with the kind of thinness that comes from deliberate fasting rather than shortage, a thinness that has a different quality than the malnutrition thinness of the longer-serving conscripts. His face was wrapped in the layered cloth of his office. I had never seen the whole of it, and my briefing materials had been non-specific about what seeing it might entail. When a Void Prophet conducted blessings for a unit, the procedure was straightforward and obligatory. The men assembled in the widest available section of the trench, and the prophet moved along the line. For each man, a brief laying on of hands, palm flat to the forehead, a murmured invocation in a language that was not any language I had been briefed on, and then a touch to the shoulder, the left shoulder, where the brand typically sat on the Heretic conscript's frame. The sequence was consistent. I had observed it from the far end of the formation when the prophet visited 2nd Company 3 months prior. Forehead, murmur, shoulder, perhaps 8 seconds per man. Methodical, continuous. I had avoided the blessing twice before. In month 2, I'd been assigned to a carrying party, and the prophet's visit had not been scheduled to align with the work detail roster, which had been either fortune or providence, depending on which framework you applied to it. In month 1, there had been a prophet visit that the whole company missed because of the trench flux that swept through the section in the 2nd week, and which the company officer appeared genuinely relieved to defer. This time there was no carrying party, and I was in full health, and Dakan had announced the assembly with the specific flatness of a man who does not consider it appropriate to indicate how he feels about an order in the act of transmitting it. I stood in the line between Hagen, 3 positions to my left, a man who smelled permanently of the cleaning fuel he applied to his rifle with monastic regularity, and who had never once shown curiosity about anyone in the section, and a conscript named Brett, who had arrived 2 weeks earlier and still had the hollow eyes of a man recently submerged in something cold enough to alter his understanding of temperature. I kept my posture in Vasek Kren's register, slightly hunched, weight on the left foot, looking at the ground ahead rather than at the prophet's progress down the line. Vasek Kren was not afraid of the blessing. He had been blessed before, as all heretic conscripts were. He had no reason to be afraid. When the prophet reached me, I bowed my head. The hand on my forehead was dry and cold, not uncomfortably so. The environmental cold of the trench in the early evening was worse, but a specific cold that had a different origin than weather. The invocation was murmured at a distance my ears registered as perhaps 3 inches from my face. The language was older than anything in my briefing materials. It lasted 7 seconds by my internal count. The hand lifted. It did not move to my shoulder. I heard the prophet's feet shift on the duckboard. I heard the shuffle of movement as he stepped to Brett. I heard the murmured invocation for Brett, which lasted approximately the same time. I heard the touch at Brett's shoulder, the slight shift in the cloth, the different resonance of a hand pressed against fabric over bone. Nothing happened. The parade continued. Completed. The prophet departed back along the line toward the officers' section without stopping or speaking to anyone below the rank of section commander. By the time we were dismissed and moving back to the bunkers, I had reconstructed the sequence in my mind 4 times and examined it from 4 angles, looking for the alternative interpretations. Perhaps the shoulder contact had occurred and I had simply not registered it in the correct moment. Perhaps the prophet had varied the sequence for 1 man out of 31 for reasons that had nothing to do with the brand. A different kind of invocation for a different spiritual condition, a routine variation in a practice I had only observed twice at a distance. Perhaps the prophet's rhythm with heretic conscripts from the Rhine cantons differed from his rhythm with men from other regions, and the deviation was a regional accommodation rather than a flag. I worked through the perhapses carefully. I gave each one its proper weight, and the part of me trained to calculate probability ranked them in order, and the order did not make the deviation nothing. That night I signaled out of schedule. Short burst, off pattern, the danger indicator, followed by the status query for extraction timeline. The lamplighter did not respond that night. The following morning on my route along the communication trench, I found the chalk mark on the 3rd support timber at the 7th traverse, the symbol that meant hold, confirmation forthcoming. I held. Vasek Kren went to breakfast, lifted sandbags, ate his noon ration in his corner of the communication trench, and Luke Chabrol waited. Dakan found me at noon on the Thursday. I was in my usual corner with the ration, eating bread in Vasek Kren's manner, steadily, without investment in the experience, when Dakan came around the curve of the communication trench and stopped. There was a half-second of mutual assessment, the kind that any 2 people make when they encounter each other unexpectedly, and which trained men make faster and read with more resolution than untrained ones. In that half-second I noted that he was alone, that he was not carrying anything that indicated a work assignment, and that his posture was neither the purposeful transit posture of a sergeant moving through his area, nor the supervisory posture of a man checking on a subordinate. He had come looking for this specific corner with the specific knowledge that I would be in it. Then Dakan sat down on the opposite ledge, which he had never done before, and produced his own tin, and began to eat in silence. We ate for a while. The front provided its ambient rhythm, a 3-round mortar exchange somewhere north subsiding. Small arms further east, nothing concerning. The ordinary mechanical texture of a Thursday afternoon on the Levant line. Dakan finished his bread and folded the cloth it had been wrapped in with the deliberate precision of a man who has one way of doing everything and has had it long enough that alternative methods don't exist for him. He said, without looking up from the folding, "You've been here longer than the others." I said, "I know. Conscript rotation is every 6 months. You're at 8. Supply problems with the replacement batches. Northern routes have been difficult. I don't make the schedules." "No," he said. "You don't." He looked up. He had light eyes, the washed-out gray blue of someone who has spent years squinting into sun and distance, in a face that had been worked by weather and time and something else into a texture that had long since passed any age I could assign to it with confidence. The eyes didn't accuse. They didn't probe, in the way of a man who is trying to force a particular interpretation onto what he's looking at. They observed, the way he observed everything, collecting without reacting, noting without concluding, at least not in any way that he permitted to show. "The prophet," he said. I waited. He said nothing to me. I want you to understand that clearly. He said nothing about Kren and gave me no instruction regarding Kren. Dakan set the empty tin on his knee with the same methodical care he'd applied to the cloth. But he looked at me when he was leaving, the way he looks at a section commander when he is thinking about a matter that doesn't yet belong to him, but which he is deciding whether to make his business. He paused. I have seen him look that way before. I know the sequence it precedes. I kept my face still. I kept my hands still. I let the silence sit where it was and let Vasek Kren occupy it, because Vasek Kren was a Rhine Canton conscript who didn't know what the prophet's particular look preceded and had no reason to be afraid of it, because Vasek Kren had a genuine mark on his shoulder and a genuine covenant, and the only thing an authentic heretic conscript had to fear from a void prophet's attention was whatever spiritual deficiencies the prophet might identify, which were a different category of problem entirely. "I see," Vasek Kren said. Dakan looked at me for another moment with those particular eyes. Then he stood and brushed crumbs from his jacket with the same methodical precision and picked up the tin. "Get your kit squared away," he said. "Inspection tomorrow." He left. I remained in the communication trench for 3 full minutes after his footsteps faded, long enough not to appear to be following, long enough to let the calculation run. Then I went back to the sandbags. That evening, I signaled again, for the second time in 48 hours. The risk was not negligible. 2 off-schedule signals in 2 days represented an aberrant pattern that Heretic signals intelligence could potentially intercept and flag, depending on their monitoring resources in this sector, which I had assessed as moderate but not comprehensive. But the alternative was remaining in a position that was possibly compromised, with a prophet's attention possibly drawn, and no confirmed extraction timeline. The alternative was waiting blind, and waiting blind is its own category of risk, and the assessors train you to choose the risk whose profile you understand better. I signaled. No response came before I had to reseal the lantern and return to the bunker. I lay on the lower bunk by the drainage ditch and ran calculations. The bunker settled into its night rhythms, snoring, the shift of bodies in the upper racks, the specific creak of the third-tier frame that told me Hagen had turned over. The front was quieter than usual. No artillery to speak of in this sector, the sparse, sporadic small arms exchange from the north that never fully stopped but that had ceased to mean anything specific in this context. I lay still and let the calculations run. At 2 hours past last light, I heard Dakan's voice through the bunker wall. The timbers between the main sleeping area and the sergeant's partitioned corner were old and poorly fitted. Years of settlement and shell concussion had opened gaps in the joinery that the 44th's engineering resources had never gotten around to addressing, and the drainage ditch side of the lower bunk happened to lie directly adjacent to the thinnest section of that dividing wall. I had mapped this in the first 3 weeks, as I mapped all acoustic properties of any space I was required to occupy for an extended period. It costs nothing, and the information has value. 2 voices came through the timber. Dakan and Hauptmann Reval, the company officer, who spoke in the clipped register of the professional military class and whose dealings with the enlisted ranks were conducted with the efficient minimalism of a man who has many things to manage and has identified conversation as an overhead cost. 2 minutes of exchange at a level that didn't resolve through the timber. Then, clearly and distinctly in Revel's voice, "Morning. The prophet's men will collect Kren at morning ration." A pause, brief. "Dakan. I don't believe he's gone anywhere tonight." Revel's footsteps. The sound of movement, then diminishing along the officer's section. Dakan settling. I lay without moving for 1 full hour after the voices stopped. I counted my breaths, and I ran through the situation with the systematic care it required. Then, when the bunker had settled into its deepest quiet, I got up. I took what I needed and nothing that would be missed at morning ration. The canteen, already full from the evening distribution, the knife worn at the belt, which was standard kit and whose absence would be noted only if someone inventoried the bunk, and the small brass compass wrapped in linen cloth that had come across the wire with me at insertion and which had lived since then in the lining seam of my left boot, accessed twice in 8 months for signal purposes and otherwise left where it was. I left Vasek Kren's kit arranged on the bunk with the same care he would have taken, because creating disorder was noise, and noise served no one. By morning ration, I intended to be somewhere that morning ration could not reach me. I moved through the forward trench toward the sap. The forward sap was a crawl-out position extending perhaps 20 meters into no man's land. An observation spit, dug in an earlier phase of the campaign when the 44th's officers had believed forward observation posts were survivable in this sector. They had revised this belief after the second month of casualties, and the sap had been unmanned at night for at least 8 weeks by my observation. I had noted it as a potential exit route in the second week of the posting, not because I expected to need it. The planned extraction was to go through a different point entirely, but because an unmonitored aperture in a defensive line is the kind of information you collect as a matter of course, because it is always possible that circumstances will change in ways that require improvisational geometry. The circumstances had changed. I moved through the sap at a crawl, taking my time, feeling ahead with my hands for wire stakes or debris that would make noise. The ground at the sap's mouth was heavily compacted. Years of weather and the passage of working parties from both directions had pressed it into a surface that was nearly solid in the dry Levant months and treacherous in the wet ones. I emerged at the sap's forward end into the open ground between the lines and stopped. 3 full minutes of stillness. I listened. I let my eyes adjust to the dark as completely as they would. I catalogued what was audible. Distant artillery on the northern horizon, small enough to be irrelevant to my situation. No illumination rounds. No indication of active wire parties or forward listening posts within the near 100 meters. The specific texture of no man's land at night, which is not silence but the absence of human intentionality. Everything that moves out there moves for reasons that don't include you, or at least that's the professional assumption you work from. I started east. The first body was at 40 meters. This is not unusual in no man's land. The dead don't get collected efficiently in contested ground. They lie where they fall until the tactical situation permits retrieval, and in some sectors the tactical situation never permits it, and the bodies become part of the landscape in the same gradual way that shell craters become part of the landscape, incorporated into the geography of the front until they are simply there, simply part of the ground between the lines. I had encountered bodies on night crossings before and knew the particular stillness of them, the way they become their own kind of landmark. I gave this one wide clearance out of professional habit and kept my bearing east-northeast on the compass. The second body, at 60 meters, moved. I stopped. I was flat, face in the mud, watching the shape 2 meters to my left. It had been motionless when I first registered it. One darker mass among the dark masses of the cratered ground, indistinguishable from discarded kit or collapsed earth at the distance and angle from which I'd first processed it. The movement was small, not purposeful, not deliberate, but continuous. The movement of something still connected to its own body's involuntary systems. I watched it for 2 full minutes without moving. The shape settled. I waited 1 additional minute after it settled. No secondary movement. I adjusted my line slightly north and kept moving. The compass gave me my bearing east-northeast. I moved in short advances, 10 meters, then a stop, then listening, then another 10 meters, using the craters for cover when they lay on my line rather than diverting around them, keeping the profile as low as the ground permitted. The technique is slow. In a daylight crossing at full pace, I could have covered the same ground in 3 minutes. In the dark, on my stomach, managing noise, I was planning for 20. The assessor's crossing protocol prioritizes arrival over speed, and the assessor's crossing protocol has a documented success rate that I considered worth respecting. At 90 meters, I heard the dogs. The 44th used dogs for perimeter sweeps and for hunting. The hunting being the application that concerned me now, because the sweep pattern I was hearing was not random, not the arc of a wire party dog working a fixed line. It was an expanding search pattern, radiating outward from the trench system in arcs, which meant someone had checked the bunk. I had expected 30 minutes more before that happened. I had been wrong. I moved faster, accepting more noise in exchange for more distance. The ground here was heavily cratered, and I misread two shadows in quick succession. The first turned out to be a shallow depression rather than a full crater, and my knee went into it at an angle that said something unpleasant along the leg. The second was a genuine crater that I chose to use as a brief stop, lying in the bottom of it while I listened for the dog's bearings and adjusted my mental picture of where they were relative to where I needed to be. The dogs were not closing. They were active in an arc that was sweeping south of my line, which was either navigation fortune or the result of the section's assumptions about where a fleeing man would go, which was probably south toward the route that would take him into the Ottoman lines, since the 44th's tactical imagination did not naturally account for someone trying to reach New Antioch's positions. I kept east. At 115 meters, I found the wire. The Heretic forward wire in this sector was years old and had been repaired and re-repaired until it was less a constructed obstacle than an archaeological deposit. Old emplacements and new emplacements layered over each other, some strands half buried by accumulated debris, some strands elevated on stakes that had shifted with the ground over successive winters. In the dark, it was nearly invisible. I found the first strand with my shin before I'd registered it visually, and lay still for 60 seconds afterward while I assessed whether the contact had made enough noise to matter. It hadn't. I moved along the wire line looking for gaps. Shell gaps were the most reliable. They were large enough to pass through without cutting, and cutting was both slow and loud, and represented a time expenditure I could not afford with the dogs active behind me. At 130 meters, I found what I was looking for. A crater impact from a shell large enough to have folded a section of wire back on itself, leaving a passage perhaps 2 meters wide at the base. I went through on my stomach, one limb at a time, testing the clearance with each movement, pausing between limbs to listen. I was halfway through when something came out of the large crater on my left. I don't know what it was. I've been asked this question by the assessor's debriefers, by the church's intelligence examiners, and by one very calm individual who identified himself only as a theological analyst and who took notes in a shorthand I couldn't read. My answer has not changed and will not change. I don't know what it was. It was not the size of a man. It occupied more volume than a man, but didn't use the volume the way a man would. It was larger in some dimensions than a body has rights to be, and absent in others where presence should have been consistent with the first. It moved on something approximately like legs, in the way that a word in a language you don't speak might be approximately like a word you know, recognizably related but operating under different rules. The movement was wrong not in the way of injury or damage, but in the way of a thing for which the rules of movement are recommendations rather than constraints. The air around it was cold. Not the cold of the Levant night, which was itself considerable, a cold with a different origin, the kind that sits specifically behind your eyes and has nothing to do with ambient temperature and everything to do with the proximity of something that should not be present in the space it is occupying. I have felt variations of this cold twice before in my professional life, and each time I have understood it as a signal to be very still and very patient, and to make no decisions that are not necessary. I pressed myself flat in the wire gap and did not breathe. The thing moved perpendicular to my line of travel. It crossed my path at 12 to 15 meters ahead of me, heading east to west, from the church side of no man's land toward the Heretic side, as though following something I could not perceive. A bearing, or a signal, or some quality of the ground in that direction that had meaning in whatever register it operated in. It paused. I counted by heartbeat, which was unreliable under the circumstances because my heartbeat was not in a reliable state, but the count came to somewhere between 35 and 50 seconds. The thing stood, if stood is a word that applies, at the point where it had stopped. and the quality of the cold shifted, became more specific, more directional, more aware of something in a particular location, more aware of me. The assessor's training on infernal entities covers their sensory profiles at some length and from several angles, most of them theoretical. The brands of the heretic faithful carry a consecrated signature, a spiritual weight that such entities can orient toward or away from, depending on the entity's nature and its relationship to the powers that consecrated the mark. Church relics and consecrated artifacts carry opposing signatures. The landscape of the spiritual conflict, as the instructors describe it, is one in which entities navigate by these signatures the way navigators use landmarks. They tell the entity where it is in relation to what matters, and what matters is determined by what the entity serves. My false brand carried neither signature. The assessor's surgeon had created a mark that was physically convincing. It carried no spiritual weight. It didn't register as heretic covenant or as church consecration, in whatever the register is. And the theological analyst's expression when I used the word register was the expression of someone who has more precise terminology for the concept and has decided not to introduce it at this juncture. I was absent, not neutral, which implies a position on a scale. Absent. A gap in the expected pattern. A gap is not protection. I want to be clear about this because it would be comforting to read the next 40 seconds as something other than what they were. A gap is not protection. It is a different category of wrongness, and different categories of wrongness attract different kinds of attention. The cold that had become directional remained directional for what my heartbeat counted as 40 seconds. The thing did not move toward me. It did not resolve the attention into approach. After 40 seconds, or 50, or perhaps 35, it moved on. It continued west. The cold diminished in a gradient as it increased its distance, and by the time I judged it to be 100 meters away, the cold had returned to ordinary Levant night cold, which was itself considerable, and I lay in the wire gap for one more full minute and then moved through the remainder of it and continued east. The dogs were still audible behind me at intervals, not closing. I kept east. At 180 meters, the wire gave way to the middle ground, the zone specific to this sector where both sides' emplacements had been destroyed, and neither had fully replaced them, and the ground was more consistently cratered and older, and the smell of it was different from the forward ground in a way that I noted without analysis and kept moving through. Some of the craters here were deep enough to lose a man in entirely. I gave the deepest ones a wide berth. At 230 meters, the ground began to compact again under my hands. Less cratered, more trodden, the beginning of the approach to church wire. The emplacements here were newer and better maintained, the stakes set with more consistent spacing. The church's engineers are thorough in ways the heretic engineers are not, or thorough in different ways, which is perhaps a distinction without practical difference when you are navigating their wire on your stomach in the dark. I found a shell gap at 250 meters. Clean impact, both sides blown clear. I cleared it with more confidence than the first, though not with less care. At this depth in no man's land, the church's listening devices were a consideration, as I had been briefed on their placement patterns in this sector before insertion 8 months ago, information that I had retained and which was still, as far as I could assess, accurate. At 270 meters I heard the voices. Ahead of me, low, in Arabic, 2 men from the acoustic signature in a shallow scrape position on the forward slope of the low ridge that defined this section of the church's extended observation perimeter. New Antioch forward picket, almost certainly one of the 4-man listening posts that the 9th New Antioch Line Infantry maintained at interval along this sector, as I knew from pre-insertion briefing and from my own Thursday signal observations of their positioning patterns. They were not alarmed. The cadence of their voices was the cadence of men who are awake because they are required to be awake, and who are maintaining their wakefulness through conversation that has nothing to do with the ground between the lines. I went wide to the north, 40 extra meters, moving at my slowest pace, not trusting any acceleration. The dogs behind me had gone quiet, lost line most likely, or working a false trail. I curved north, then east, then south, passing the picket position at what I judged to be a sufficient distance, and at 290 meters I came up over a low ridge and saw the parapet. I lay for a full minute and looked at it. The fire step profile, the sandbag construction, the riveting angle that distinguishes New Antioch's line from Heretic construction in ways you can read at this distance in poor light if you have studied both for long enough. The particular way church engineers set the sandbag courses at the parapet top, slightly different from the Heretic pattern, a difference of perhaps 15 degrees in the outer face angle that has to do with the respective training doctrines and carries no tactical significance, but which I registered with something that was close to relief, to recognizing a thing that belonged to your own world rather than the borrowed one you've been living in. Then I stood up and walked toward it. 3 things happened very quickly. A voice challenged in French from the parapet. The standard field challenge, 2 syllables, sharp. I raised my hands and gave the response phrase, or began to give it, and realized simultaneously that I was wearing Heretic conscript's uniform, that the identification phrase for the Levant sector had been given to me at briefing 8 months ago, and that 8 months of being someone else had placed it somewhere in my memory that required a moment to access. The moment lasted 2 or 3 seconds. In a close contact challenge in a forward trench at night, 2 or 3 seconds is a category of mistake. What came out of my mouth may have been the correct phrase. I am genuinely uncertain. The phonemes were right, but the order may not have been. The rifle butt to the shoulder was precautionary. I understood this. It knocked me sideways into the mud in front of the parapet, and there were hands on me before I finished going down. Wrists pulled together behind my back, face pressed into the ground, voices in rapid French exchanging words I couldn't fully resolve from that angle. I said, in my own French rather than Vasek Kren's, that I was a church intelligence officer, that I needed to speak to whoever was commanding this section, that I understood the situation appeared to contradict this claim. Someone hit me again. Still precautionary, still accurate. I stopped trying to explain myself in the mud and waited to be moved somewhere that explaining would be more productive. They dragged me over the parapet and into the trench. 2 checkpoints, each involving further shouting and a level of physical management that was roughly consistent with what I would have applied to someone found crawling out of Heretic lines in Heretic uniform. At the second checkpoint, a corporal ran his hands over my kit and found the compass and the knife and removed both without comment. Then a communication trench, and then a dugout with a candle and a table and a lieutenant. He was young, perhaps 22, with the exhaustion of someone who has been at the front long enough for it to become ordinary and terrible in equal and simultaneous measure. He looked at me steadily, the way young officers learn to look at things they weren't trained for, cataloging carefully, making no premature expressions of conclusion. "You crossed from the Heretic lines," he said. "In uniform." "Yes." "You're claiming to be a church intelligence officer." "I am a church intelligence officer, 8 months embedded in the 44th Heretic Legion, 3rd Company. My insertion name was Vasek Kren. My actual name I can provide to a senior officer with assessor's clearance. The identification phrase that opens that conversation is..." And I gave it. He wrote something on the paper in front of him. He was not writing down what I had said. He was writing a date and possibly a time, an administrative record, the record of when an infiltrator had been brought in. "That phrase," he said, "is standard signals intelligence protocol, not field operative protocol. I've been inside for 8 months. I may have the wrong phrase." He looked at me steadily for another moment. "You understand that what you've described is the account I received from Heretic infiltrators. It's the most reliable account, because it's the most plausible one." I said I understood that. "The last 3 we processed," he said without emphasis, as a statement of fact, "we shot at dawn." I said I understood that too. He sent for his senior NCO and had me moved to the supply recess at the back of the dugout, wrists bound with section wire. The guard was a corporal with a rifle across his knees who sat on an ammunition box and looked at the middle distance with the neutral competence of someone performing an assigned task and prepared to take whatever actions the assignment required at whatever time those actions became necessary. I sat against the dugout wall across from him and settled into waiting. Waiting is a skill. It is a skill that can be performed well or performed badly, and performing it badly, with impatience or with cognitive restlessness, or with the particular counterproductive energy of a mind that knows it cannot resolve the situation and continues trying anyway, is a waste of whatever resources you still have. I performed it as well as I could. The bunker around me did its night things. I sat and let them proceed without requiring participation. At some point, I slept, which I had not expected of myself. There is a quality of exhaustion that overrides every other concern, including the concern about whether the morning will be the last morning, and this was that quality of exhaustion. I had been running at operational intensity for over 30 hours, including the crossing. The body makes its own negotiations. I woke at first light to stand to, which sounded the same from inside as it had from outside. The same machinery, the same sequence of sounds, in French rather than Dakan's language, and God rather than the old gods, but structurally identical. The front is the front on both sides of the wire. At 6:30, Bossard came. Captain Bossard was perhaps 40, with the settled decisiveness of a man who had stopped deferring conclusions several years ago and found the practice of deferral to be overhead without benefit. He looked at me for 10 seconds. He asked my insertion date and the name of the assessor's liaison at the new Antioch station. I answered both correctly. "That tells me you were well briefed," he said. "It doesn't tell me by whom." I said, "Send a message to regimental headquarters requesting assessor's clearance verification on my description and insertion date. It will take time. I will wait." The line to regimental, he explained, was intercepted 2 stations out. That route was unreliable for sensitive traffic. I said, "Send a runner." He considered this. Then he left. The corporal and I spent the morning in the supply recess. At some point, someone pushed a tin of something warm through the entrance without comment. I held it in both hands and let it cool and eventually ate what was in it. At mid-morning, Bossard returned to say the runner had been sent. The finding, if no verification came through by dawn the following day, would be infiltrator in enemy uniform. He said this not with the emphasis of a threat, but with the flat clarity of a man describing a procedure that he would apply whether he wished to or not. I said I understood. "Summary inquiry at dawn plus 1 hour, he said. "You'll be permitted to make a statement." I made the statement at the inquiry. The wide trench bay, the plank table, 3 officers, the corporal, and 2 others at the sides, my wrists still wired. I gave the full account, the insertion, the 8 months, the Thursday signals, the void prophet, and the shoulder sequence that had not completed, Dakan's warning in the communication trench, the decision to cross, the entity in the crater. When I reached the entity, the thin officer with the careful face began writing in a notebook. He wrote without looking up until I described the 40 seconds of directed cold and what I had reasoned about the false brand's absence of spiritual signature, and then he looked up and stayed looking up until I finished. Bossard said, "Documentation." I said, "Nothing that would survive examination of a heretic conscript's kit." He nodded. "The runner returned this morning. Regimental has no record of an active assessor's insertion in this sector. They wouldn't. The assessors maintain independent records. That is the operational point of the assessors." "Yes," he said, "and a well-briefed infiltrator would also know that." The pause that followed was not deliberative. It was terminal. Bossard had decided before the inquiry began, as I had understood he would. The inquiry was the form the decision required, and the form was now complete. "We'll proceed to finding," he said. "You have—" The boots on the duckboards stopped him. Not running. Moving at purpose speed, the rhythm of a man who has been moving at that pace for some time and whose pace does not respond to obstacles. The guards at the bay entrance moved aside without instruction, which was the information I needed before I saw the man himself. He came through the entrance in a traveling coat muddy at the hem, close-cropped gray hair, a bearing that communicated authority without performing it. He looked at me, then at Bossard. The look at me lasted approximately 2 seconds and told me he was satisfied with what he saw. The look at Bossard lasted 1 second and communicated several things at once without requiring them to be said. "Captain," he said, in a voice that didn't need volume, "this man is mine." Cardinal Assessor Vernot. I didn't know his name until New Antioch, when it appeared on a document. At the time, I knew only that the guards had moved aside and Bussard was accepting credentials and someone was cutting the wire from my wrists with a field knife. The car had come up from the second line, a long vehicle of the kind used for senior staff movements, which had no business being this close to the forward positions, and whose presence communicated more about Vernot's authority than anything he said. There was a brief administrative exchange, documents, signatures, the formalities of transfer of custody, and then the trench bay was no longer concerning itself with me, and I was in the communication trench moving toward the rear, and the inquiry's conclusion had been deferred into irrelevance by something with more institutional weight than a company captain. Vernot walked slightly ahead with his escort. In the communication trench, he stopped and waited for me to come level. "The prophet flagged you in the blessing," he said. Not a question. He didn't complete the sequence. He didn't touch the shoulder. And Dakan warned me in a way that gave him no accountability for having done so. Whether he knew what he was warning me about, I can't say with certainty. He nodded once, the gesture of a man confirming something he had already assessed from the available information, doing so as a matter of accuracy rather than surprise. "You were 3 days from extraction," he said. 2 by the time I crossed. "Yes." We moved. The second line was visible ahead, the density of men and material that marks the difference between forward and support. "The lamplighter?" I asked. "Never at risk. They were never the variable." He paused. "You were." I processed this. 8 months as the variable. The posting had produced clean intelligence, complete coverage, a unit profile that the assessor's planning staff had called precise and operationally significant. And then the last 72 hours had produced a near collection by a void prophet's people, a night crossing under active search conditions, an encounter with something in no man's land that I still had no adequate name for, and a summary inquiry that had been minutes from proceeding to its finding when the car arrived. "The thing in the crater," Vernot said. I described it in full. He listened without interrupting, the particular quality of listening that doesn't impose its framework on what it's receiving. When I described the 40 seconds of directed cold and the reasoning about the false brand's absent signature, he said, "A gap. That's the word I used. It's the accurate word." He was quiet for a moment. "A false brand carries no spiritual signature. In whatever register those entities navigate by, you were simply absent. Not church, not heretic, not consecrated in any direction. A space where a signal should have registered and didn't." It paused. It seemed to be deciding something. "Yes," he said. "There are entities that find gaps interesting, that are drawn to the space where a mark should be and isn't. The absence rather than the presence. We have other accounts." He looked at me briefly. "It has implications. For how you mark the people you send across, among other things." He left the subject there. The assessors don't explain what they're not explaining, and they do this consistently enough that you learn to note the shape of the silence rather than pushing at it. At the staging post, 4 kilometers back, there was a room with a wooden floor, a chair, and a full meal that had no business existing at this distance from the forward line, which I ate without asking any questions about its origin. Vernot came to the room at midday. "New Antioch," he said. 3 to 5 days of debrief, medical evaluation, a review of your field rotation status." I asked what the review meant. He looked at me with the assessment of a man who has evaluated a large number of people and has found this one to be approximately what the profile indicated. 8 months is a long insertion. The Prophet incident tells us the operational window for your profile in this sector has closed. We won't send you back there." "All right." He was nearly at the door when he paused. "The entity in the crater. You said it moved on. After 40 seconds, it continued west, toward the Heretic lines." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Not a pause of consideration, a pause of deciding how much to say. The gap that your false brand created, he said slowly, is a signature of a particular kind. Not consecrated, not covenant, but legible to certain things as the absence of both. There are entities that track such signatures, not because they want what's in the gap, but because the gap indicates something that's being hidden, and what's being hidden interests them. He looked at me. You weren't safe. You were simply not what it was looking for at that moment. The distinction matters. I understand the distinction. Good, he said. Think about it carefully before the debrief. The theological analyst will have questions that will benefit from your having thought about it. He left. I sat in the chair with the remains of the meal and thought about it. I slept for 14 hours in that room. When I woke, it was dark and the front was a low muttering on the horizon, and for a moment, the brief territory between sleep and the reassembled working mind, I was in the lower bunk by the drainage ditch. I could hear Dakin's boots on the duckboards. I thought it was 4 in the morning and the day was beginning. The moment passed. It passed in 2 or 3 seconds, as it usually did, and then I was in the room with the wooden floor and the candle stub and the distant front that was not my front. And Vasek Kren was where he had been for 8 months. At the back of my mind, behind my eyes, available when needed, and otherwise quiet. He was quieter now than he had been. The machinery that ran him was winding down, as it always did in the days after an extraction, the performance unwinding from the inside out, the original architecture reasserting its precedence without urgency or drama. It took time. It always took time. I thought about Dakan, about the way he'd sat across from me in the communication trench and said, "You've been here longer than the others," about the way he'd given me the information about the Prophet's attention, told me exactly what I needed to know in a way that gave him no formal accountability for having told me. I did not know what he understood about Vasek Kren. I did not know whether his warning was professional distance from a problem that wasn't yet formally his, or something that operated under a different, more human logic. I didn't know which interpretation would have been more surprising to him, and I wouldn't know, because Dakan was on the other side of 300 meters of contested ground and would remain there regardless of what the debriefers in New Antioch did with the information I would give them about his habits, his patterns, his particular quality of sideways watching. The debriefers would want everything about Dakan. I would give them everything. That was what the extraction was for. The car came at 8:30 in the morning. Frère Hamel, Church Administrative Auxiliary, traveling coat, travel document. The young man from internal security sat beside me in the back and didn't speak except once at the second checkpoint when he said quietly, "You don't need to speak at checkpoints." I said, "I know." We didn't speak again. The road south took 4 hours through the layered infrastructure of the front support system, supply depots, casualty clearing stations, the administrative apparatus that makes a long war function at distance from its own violence, and then out into the older Levant landscape, where the war had either not yet reached or had passed through and kept moving, and the villages sat in their ancient arrangements, and the roads between them were the same roads that had carried armies in every direction for 2,000 years, and would carry them for 2,000 more. At the midway stop, a church administrative post in a repurposed stone building with a courtyard and a fig tree that had survived everything the century had applied to it, Verneau came around the car and handed me coffee, better than anything I had tasted in 8 months. I stood in the shade of the fig tree and held the tin and thought about nothing for a moment. Somewhere northwest, the front was still going. The machinery was still running. The work parties, the rations, the morning stand-to, the specific flatness of Dakan's commands at 4 in the morning. All of it was continuing without my participation in it, as it had continued before my insertion and would continue after my extraction, because the machinery of the front is not interested in the individuals it runs through. I finished the coffee, got back in the car. The gates of New Antioch were visible by mid-afternoon, the lower city walls, the harbor. The particular quality of light off the sea that is specific to this coast because of what New Antioch is and has been for centuries and continues to be regardless of what the century does to the land around it. I had grown up in those streets. I knew them at every hour, in every season, in the precise way that you know the streets of a place where you were formed rather than where you simply lived. The customs offices where my father had spent 30 years, the market where my mother had read cards and told people, kindly, something like the truth. Frere Hamel looked out the window and kept his face arranged in the expression of a man returning from administrative duties. Luc Chabrol waited. He had learned over the course of 4 postings to wait for the moment when the car stopped and the door opened and the clean air of arrival came in. And in that moment, briefly, before the debrief and the medical evaluation and the rotation review and all the machinery of return, he was simply himself. In a city he knew. Alive. No longer someone else. The debrief would begin in the morning. There was time enough. The city received the car the way cities receive everything that comes to them. Without acknowledgement, without ceremony, without the particular attention that individuals imagine they deserve when they have done difficult things in difficult places. That is the correct response. The city was right. The difficult things had been done for reasons that the city's continued existence expressed, and the city expressed them without comment. The gate opened. The car moved through. New Antioch closed around us in the ordinary way of a city going about its afternoon, and it was, after 8 months of everything else, the most welcome thing I could have been offered. The debriefing began the following morning at 8 o'clock sharp. It lasted 4 days. I was thorough. The theological analyst had many questions about the entity in the crater. I answered them as precisely as I could. I never learned what they concluded.